I'm Mary Beard.
And I'm Charlotte Higgins.
Welcome to Exploring the Odyssey.
This is a book club where we really drill down into some of the most exciting bits of Homer's epic poem. Whether it's your first time
or whether you're taking another stab at it,
we'll be here to share our debates, our questions and our insights. It's just one of the most remarkable things in the poem.
This is a story that captures the imagination.
And you kind of go, ugh!
There's quite a lot of the consumption of human flesh in this part of the Odyssey.
This is a super good bit. It's absolutely knockout.
We'll give you some background information that you might need to get the most out of the poem.
It's going to be serious reading,
but with a lot of jokes, a lot of fun, and quite a few laughs along the way.
So put the kettle on,
or pour yourself a large glass of wine
and read along with us.
To join, go to exploringtheodyssey.com. Watch or listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The first emperor, Augustus, brought about the biggest revolution in the history of Rome. Or was it really Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa that did it?
The usual story is that after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, and after more than 10 years of civil wars that followed, Augustus finally dispensed with what was left of Rome's sort of democracy and established the system of one-man rule that would last till the very end of Roman time.
But revolutionary leaders never really act alone. They always need support and backup, what we often call their right-hand men. And sometimes the figurehead isn't actually the person who gets things done.
In Augustus's case, wherever you find him, scratch the surface and you'll find Agrippa there too, whether that's commanding the troops, building the ships,
or constructing the aqueducts, or sorting out the city's sewage problems, and being part of the imperial family, literally. Agrippa was married to Augustus's niece, then to his daughter Julia, and all those notorious Agrippinas that we find later on in the Roman court and in the emperor's bed, they are all descended from Agrippa.
But it's very hard to uncover his point of view, or even to see what his power really was. How far did he want to remain in the shadows? What did it feel like to be the kingmaker, but not the king?
Well, Agrippa is perfect material for a novelist's imagination, and this year he really does get his moment in the spotlight, thanks to the great novelist Robert Harris, who has written a new fictional biography of Agrippa, and it's out at the end of August, which I think is kind of ironic because he's overshadowed by Augustus yet again.
Next time we're going to be talking to Robert about how he brought Agrippa back to life and some of the modern parallels for him that he had in mind. But this time we'll be wondering about what Agrippa's history looks like without the help of fiction. This is Instant Classics, the podcast that uncovers the ancient stories still shaping the world today. I'm Mary Beard.
And I'm Charlotte Higgins. Each week we dive into the myths, the dramas and the characters of the classical world to discover what they still mean to us now. This week, Marcus Agrippa, the power behind the throne.
We're going to have to start by setting the scene in a bit more detail, kind of the backdrop really we need to Agrippa's life from his birth in probably around 63 BC, we don't actually know, to his death in 12 BCE. So Charlotte, start us off on this.
I will do. I mean, what a scene to set, because it's a ferociously, desperately complicated period of history that we're thinking about here. Let's just park us in this decade for a moment between the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Ides of March, 44 BCE, and the Battle of Actium in 31, when Augustus defeated Antony and Cleopatra and became sole ruler of the Roman world. And okay, that sounds simple, but it's actually super complicated because everybody ends up fighting everybody else, but in slightly different combinations. So the ones who were loyal to Julius Caesar end up finishing off the assassins, Brutus and Cassius, and their armies in 42. But then they turn on each other with many, many twists in the tale until the last man standing basically is Augustus. I mean, he starts his life as Octavian, he becomes Augustus. Let's not further complicate this period of history, Mary, by calling him anything but Augustus. Do you agree?
Totally. I mean, I'm sorry if the purists out there are going to be very cross when we call him Augustus, when he was, for quite a lot of that period, known as Octavius. But this period is complicated enough without Augustus having two names. So this episode, perhaps be different. Next episode, he's Augustus.
And we mustn't forget, there's a footnote to this like scene setting, which there's also this other war going on, which is Sextus Pompeius, who everyone forgets about, the son of Pompey, who was Julius Caesar's great rival, who has his fleet. And he's sort of he's fighting on sort of pretty much throughout this period until 35 BCE. He's kind of fighting a sort of leftover hangover of the first part of the Civil War. So it's a rich tapestry, let's say, Mary.
It looks as if it gets a bit simpler, and actually it does get a bit simpler once Augustus has defeated Antony and Cleopatra. And we did a bit about that defeat when we were looking at Cleopatra a bit ago on the podcast. Agrippa's next phase of life is played out against a decade and a half, 2 decades of Augustus establishing himself in power. And that is a period which is probably more complicated than it's often treated as being. Augustus gets back from Egypt. What he's got to do at that point, and this is the real background to the last 20 years of Agrippa's life, what Augustus has got to do is hammer out what his one-man rule regime is going to look like. Now, it's easy to say, and Augustus then established himself as one-man ruler, but he doesn't really have a blueprint. What happened to Julius Caesar, i.e. daggers in the front and back, was not a good example. And he's really in uncharted territory. And I think, although it's very hard to see this retrospectively, and Roman writers, most of our historical sources for the early part of Augustus's reign entirely, are written much later. They also tend to see it as a bit of a foregone conclusion. But he's improvising, he's trying to find out how to establish himself. And of course, he's wondering about what comes after him. He's wondering about the succession. Is this going to be a dynasty? And it's pretty clear that he decides early on that it is going to be a dynasty. But if so, who is going to succeed him, right?
Yeah, that's a brilliant reminder, Mary, of historical contingency. Like, it just all looks like it was part of a beautiful plan when you see it from a distance of time. But actually, life doesn't work like that. We know that in reality. And people are generally fumbling their way towards solving problems and finding solutions on the spot. So really good reminder.
It's absolutely right. I mean, and in Dio's Roman history, written a couple of centuries after Augustus, I mean, he actually stages the most wonderful kind of retrospect, because he decides, he situates Augustus having a debate. Am I going to have democracy, or am I going to have one-man rule and monarchy? They have a chat and they decide they're going to have one-man rule, and then on they go. But it must have been really messy on the ground. And I think the messier we imagine Augustus's early period of power is, probably the better. But
yeah,
that
messy
is
and bloody.
Messy, yeah. But we'll come to that later, because I think we've got to think. Agrippa is a man who's in the centre of all that. But where does he come from?
Yes.
What exact part he plays is really difficult to pin down, because for a start, he did write his memoirs, like so many of them did, but they were, quote, lost. There's no surviving biography of him. And so if you want to kind of trace Agrippa's life, what you have to do is piece it together from sometimes very casual references, or moments when in a standard history, some later author will say, oh, no, that was the role that Agrippa played there. There isn't anything which actually puts the spotlight on him directly. I mean, there's, one funny bit in somebody we keep coming back to in the podcast, Pliny the Elder, the kind of the mad polymath encyclopedist. Well, he's the person who says, oh, Agrippa was born by breech birth, so when people are trying to write the story of Agrippa, they have somewhere to start, but nothing much else. I mean, he's not...
It's a weirdly irrelevant detail
totally
to have at your command when you're trying to figure out the life of someone who was really behind so many military and infrastructural victories. I think we can call them infrastructural victories behind Augustus. It's such a weird thing that he's such a fragmentary person. So do we know anything about his background, his parents, his childhood, what sort of social status he had?
Not super posh. I mean, he wasn't, a lot of these figures who turn up in Roman politics, we often say from a humble background. Well, humble by comparison with somebody like Augustus, who was supposed to be descended from, this great line going back ultimately to the goddess Venus.
You can't get posher than that.
No, but Agrippa isn't like that. He's not super posh. We don't know anything about his childhood. What we do know is that he was enough of a friend and ally of Augustus, the future Emperor Augustus, to be with him at the town of Apollonia, which is in modern Albania. I mean, they're partly on military training, they're partly doing a bit of culture come higher education there. He's with Augustus in Apollonia when the news reaches them that Julius Caesar, Augustus's great uncle, has been killed. Right, so he's with Augustus at that crucial moment. They're both of them under 20. They're still teenagers, right? And they come back to Italy together, really in order to put Augustus's hand in the ring in the power struggles that then follow. That's partly because Julius Caesar had named Augustus, as they discover, as his heir in his will. Now, that did not go down well with Mark Antony, another right-hand man here, with Mark Antony, who'd been the right-hand man of Julius Caesar and was anticipating that he would step in Julius Caesar's shoes. So we've got, from the very beginning, there's clearly going to be tensions. But Augustus plus Agrippa come back from Apollonia to play their part and further Augustus's ambitions. And from that moment on, it looks as if Agrippa's present with Augustus, except when they're kind of absent from each other, fighting or whatever. He's present behind the scenes and instrumental at almost every key moment of Augustus's rise to power, although Agrippa doesn't often hit the headlines.
So fascinating. So whatever happened in Albania, clearly there was a hugely strong bond between them. And then he, despite not being super posh, Agrippa comes back and actually ends up having the role of prosecuting one of the assassins of Julius Caesar, Cassius, which which happens successfully. He prosecutes and convicts Cassius.
Cassius wasn't there, so it perhaps was a slightly
In
easier case.
absentia.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but yes,
okay, fair enough.
yeah.
Unable to defend. Yes, he wasn't standing in the dock, that's for sure. And then he is part of the army that defeats the combined Brutus and Cassius forces at the Battle of Philippi in northern Greece, where they are defeated. And this is in the phase where Mark Antony and Augustus are at least nominally united before it all goes horribly wrong. And you get this sort of intriguing thing that, and it's such a sort of fascinating thing to speculate about, that Augustus was very ill at the time. So Agrippa's is in the thick of it doing some fighting, and Augustus falls ill, which seems to be a recurring pattern in Augustus's life, that he gets ill at these sort of crucial moments of peril, physical peril often. And it's such a peculiar thing for this man who is the ultimate political survivor, but so maybe psychosomatically, or maybe, I don't know, what do you think? Is it self-preservation?
This is being a bit unfair to Augustus, but you can almost reckon that if a great, big, serious conflict is coming up, Augustus will be doing a sickie, I'm afraid.
Take to his bed.
And take to his bed. And the story about Philippi, we're told that he was on the battlefield, but he was being carried round it in a litter, right? Now, you think, that is what a fighting force needs, like a hole in the head, isn't it? Not only are you trying to fight the assassins of Caesar, but you've got one of your nominal commanders being carried around the battlefield by some tough squaddies in a litter, while Agrippa, as always, is soldiering on, right? And that's Agrippa's job. He soldiers on, and if you try, we're going to kind of fast forward a bit, but if you go through the next few years, I mean, Agrippa is the guy who masterminds the suppression of a rebellion in Gaul, and it's Agrippa, whoever's technically in command, it's Agrippa who actually finishes off Sextus Pompeius in a great sea battle. He's not yet 30.
I mean, it is extraordinary. It is absolutely extraordinary. But then when you sort of plunge on a bit in history, you then get to the Battle of Actium, which is after this, after the sort of tenuous alliance between Augustus and Mark Antony has collapsed. They are inevitably fighting each other, and the confrontation at sea happens at Actium. The standard issue sort of account of this from Roman historians, inflected by Augustus himself, is that it's a glorious triumph for Augustus, and he actually gets a triumph for it, the ceremonial triumph. But it maybe wasn't quite like that, Mary.
No, I think that it's another one of those kind of moments where on the surface all the glory goes to Augustus himself, and poets celebrate Augustus's great victory at Actium, but when later historians are going through what actually happened at the battle, they're all agreed that the tactics of the battle were devised by Agrippa. In fact, he kind of countermands Augustus's view of how the battle should take place, and that if you're looking for the guy in the lead, standing on the ship, rallying the troops, it is Agrippa, while Augustus himself is actually in a small skiff, kind of on the sidelines, kind of cheering the guys on, So, so it's Agrippa's victory. I have to say, in this case, Agrippa is helped by the fact that basically Antony and Cleopatra run away.
Maybe that Horace poem Nunc est bibendum, the ode that kind of commemorates and celebrates the Battle of Actium, would look a bit different if it had been a bit more truthful about Agrippa's role. This is a poem we talked about in one of our Cleopatra episodes. But it does at least say that Cleopatra ran away. I think that's sort of unavoidable truth there that even propaganda couldn't quite conceal.
So basically, I mean, if you're cutting this long story short, basically, you've got Augustus with all the credentials. He's got the aristocratic ancestry, and he was Julius Caesar's chosen heir, so he's got everything going for him to become the successor of Caesar. And Agrippa doesn't, but Agrippa is the guy who puts Augustus there. Agrippa is, in a military sense, certainly, he's the real kingmaker. It's Agrippa what won it, really. You do feel yourself, especially when you think how young he was, that
Yeah.
both Agrippa and Augustus was. You think, well, with what authority? And that's a tricky one. I mean, a lot of it is the kind of, I think, the de facto authority that you can get if you're in the middle of the Civil War. But he also has a really accelerated career, and he holds, during this period when he's doing so much fighting, he holds some of the most important offices. I mean, he is, for example, consul, the top office of the Roman Republic, when he's only 27, far too early to hold that office.
Yeah, because these offices were supposedly age limited, weren't they? You had to reach, at least officially speaking, you had to reach a certain age before you were eligible to be elected consul and these other senior magistracies, as we call them. But this gets skipped quite a lot during this very turbulent, bloody period, doesn't it?
No, that's right. I mean, you should basically, and there's some exceptions to this, you should basically be 40 before you become a consul. And
Quite right.
Agrippa is, right. Romans knew that age brought responsibility. I mean, it's not just that he's kind of having those official positions. He's actually, while all this, or in between all this fighting, I mean, we tend to forget, I think, that, life in Rome is going on. It's not, and Agrippa's doing, you mentioned his kind of infrastructural interests. Well, already in the late 30s, this is before Augustus has kind of won, right? He's starting a big program of aqueduct improvement, and he's sorting out the sewage system. Now, one of the most famous monuments in Rome is the Cloaca Maxima, the great drain into which actually the shit literally falls, and it was in a terrible state. And there is a wonderful little vignette, and it's only a vignette, of Agrippa getting in a boat and going through the Cloaca Maxima to inspect it personally, to see what should be done. I mean, it must have been so disgusting, and so smelly, and so germ infested, but it's a wonderful image, I think, of Agrippa having an eye for detail, not just on the battlefield, but also in terms of building infrastructure, water supply, drainage, all that kind of stuff. And in some ways, I think that image of Agrippa in his boat in the Cloaca Maxima kind of does set the tone for the next phase of his career, which is, as it were, post-Civil War, which we'll look at when we've taken a break.
So, Mary, I mean, Agrippa, we've just touched on Agrippa being the great sort of builder of aqueducts and drains, and that wonderful image of him skiffing through the horribly disgusting, enormous sewer of Rome. But, which, by the way, makes me totally warm to him in a completely irrational way. I like the idea of this man who's a kind of superb engineer, or at least organizer of engineering projects. But he keeps on being a military man, doesn't he? And he's that there's civil war may have come thankfully to a close, but of course Rome does have foreign policy to deal with, and there are, as ever, restive peoples on the borders, which he deals with, right? He goes off to the Danube and in the east of the empire. He uses various versions of putting down the restive natives, softer versions and harder versions.
just before he dies, he's out in the Danube fighting, and at the same time, just as before, he continues to hold public office. So he's consul for the first time when he was 27 in the 30s. He's consul 2 more times after that. So this is he doesn't cease when the Civil War is over, technically. He doesn't cease to be a public military man. But the issues have in some way changed from the Civil War. I mean, you're right. War doesn't end just because Augustus has come to power, but there are other priorities. And particularly, and go back to what we said about how difficult it is quite to get a feel for how Augustus and Agrippa and his other advisors are kind of strategizing for firmly establishing Augustus on the throne. There are big questions about how that power is to be underpinned, what it takes to say, I run Rome. And it looks like that Augustus is constantly, adjusting and readjusting his position, kind of setting himself above the Senate, but part of the Senate. It's all very kind of nuanced and shifting. But it looks like while that is going on, Agrippa, as you say, is doing the nitty-gritty infrastructure, which is absolutely essential to keep to get Augustus properly established. And Lindsay Powell, whose book we'll put in the show notes, I think rather nicely, a bit modernizingly, but I think it somehow sums it up. He imagines that Augustus is the CEO of Rome, the chief executive officer. Agrippa is the COO, the chief operating officer, right? And it's
Nice.
and I think there's some truth in that. And there's to use another modernizing analogy, Agrippa is very much at the forefront of what's going on at the beginning of Augustus's one-man rule, his power. He's the build baby build man, right? And he's putting up public baths. He's putting up temples. He erects one very famous temple to all the gods, the Pantheon, and a lot of this he is funding himself.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that it's not kind of, this stuff tends not to be publicly funded in Rome. It's the super phenomenal wealthy, and he made his money presumably simply from making war on people, being well, and the appropriation or being given the wealth of the various aristocratic Romans who'd been deposed, murdered, killed, defeated in the course of the civil wars. So he plunges a lot of that money into making Rome beautiful again, or whatever. So this is all part of the project, isn't it? Of shoring up a new Rome after this horrific, I mean, really, truly horrific period of civil war. I guess I have a question for you, Mary, which is, COOs and CEOs, sometimes this is a wonderful partnership. And sometimes you find that the CEO is eventually deposed and possibly the COO takes over. So, do you think there was ever any, given how many commanders and aristocrats and potential leaders had fallen out and killed each other in the previous 20 years, do you feel like that this was a completely harmonious relationship? Was he ever a serious rival or even an unserious rival to Augustus?
Well, that is the big question, and it's connected with the kind of speculations that it's hard not to go into about what were Agrippa's ambitions. Was he happy to always be the man who gets in the boat and goes into the Cloaca Maxima while Augustus is celebrating his triumph, as it were? Not quite literally, but that is the big question. And I think where you see it, where you can actually get some sense that there is a tension in this relationship, is in the question of the continuance of Augustus's dynasty, the succession, and the role of the imperial family in the image of the ruling house of Rome. And I think one of the biggest and most obvious of Augustus's problems is, not working out so much how many times he's going to be consul or what he's going to do with the Senate, but who is going to come after him when he himself has no son. Right?
Yeah.
He has a daughter, but he has no son. Though his wife, the current wife when he's in power, has two sons. Livia has two sons from previous marriage, one of whom is going to be, turns out in the end, to be...
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert, Livia's son is Tiberius, is going to become emperor later. It looks at first sight, and I think this is where the trouble comes, it looks like Agrippa is playing a bit of a backstop role in succession planning, right? And I mean, you can see that first of all, I think, in the number of wives he chooses, is made to have, is given, or whatever. Because the first wife he has is actually somebody who has a connection with the past in Roman history. He first of all marries the daughter of the orator Cicero's great friend Atticus, right? So Cicero wrote streams of letters to Atticus, which we can still read. Atticus, the guy who doesn't ever really become to the forefront of politics, but is everybody's mate and is always writing to people, the fixer behind the scene. So first of all, the first wife of Agrippa is Atticus's daughter, and is actually a daughter of that marriage, who is, just wait for the complexity, the first wife of the Emperor Tiberius.
So, interjection, it's just very easy to get divorced and remarry in this Roman situation, isn't it? And there's a lot of shifting sands in this department owing to political allegiance and cynically pragmatic realpolitik, sort of done by the means of marrying the female relations of your useful allies.
Basically, if you're a bloke, you just say, I divorce you, and that's it. There's, you don't have to provide grounds or anything like that,
Out of interest, was it as easy if, presumably, it doesn't really work the other way around?
It doesn't work quite so easily the other way around, no. But we don't actually know what happens to the first Mrs. Agrippa. She might have died, she might have been divorced, but what we know that the second wife looks very clearly like a dynastic appointment, because he marries next Augustus's niece, right? So he marries into the imperial family.
This niece, Claudia Marcella, is the daughter of Octavia, who was Augustus's sister, and Octavia herself had been married to Mark Antony. It's complicated.
It's complicated. He doesn't stay married. Agrippa doesn't stay married to Augustus's niece, Claudia Marcella, very long, because he then marries, and you can see that this is getting closer and closer to the centre of power. He then marries Augustus's daughter, Julia. When she's 17, wow. He's 42, right? And really, that you can't get closer to the heart of the imperial family than that. It is quite interesting. You can actually, there's lots and lots of stuff we don't know about Agrippa, but you can still visit at the Villa Farnesina in Rome. You can still visit the very elaborate villa, which we strongly believe, for good reasons, was actually the property of Agrippa and Julia. So you can visit one of the marital homes, even if you don't know much about them.
And by the way, it's really worth it. It's in Trastevere, and it has got the most amazing Renaissance frescoes and some Raphael frescoes. So it's totally worth it for other reasons too. But how fascinating that. So presumably, I don't know. I'm speculating in a way that no decent historian should, but it doesn't seem like the work of genius to suggest that if Augustus is marrying Agrippa to his own daughter, there's a suggestion that Julia that might produce some heirs that could potentially be, the solution to Augustus's problem of succession.
That's right, and she has loads of kids. She produces the pair called Gaius and Lucius Caesar, who clearly were marked out to be the successors of Augustus, but both died. She produces Agrippina the Elder, who the mother of Agrippina the Younger, who is the mother of Nero, right? And so on. So they, Agrippa and Julia together, are producing the people who are going to be absolutely key players in the imperial family for the next half century.
They produced the cast list of I Claudius, the second part of the I Claudius series.
That is exactly what they did. They produced a class list, and you've got. I mean, you're absolutely right, Charlotte. You've got this kind of sense that the idea is that Agrippa plus the natural, in inverted commas, daughter of Augustus should be able to produce an heir as close to Augustus's biology as you could find. There is always the sense in Rome, and it's that it can look easy to produce a lot of heirs after the fact, but there's a lot of child mortality. Children are fragile; they don't always survive, and it is pretty clear that there is an idea that if this doesn't quite work out, or if anything happens to Augustus, then Agrippa could take over. That comes out absolutely obviously in 23 BC, a decade before Agrippa dies, when Augustus, yet again, is terribly ill, right? And in his illness, he gives Agrippa his signet ring, the signet ring, which is basically the official seal with which Augustus signs his edicts, etc., etc.
Right.
He gives his signet ring.
Sort of deputise, you must deputise for me, and
yes.
The ownership of this, the holding this ring will give you my powers.
Yes, and the implication would be that if Augustus were to die, he gets better. He always gets better until he finally does.
Terrible old survivor.
Agrippa was holding the symbols of power in that signet ring. Now, I mean, you were asking about tensions. Well, in what we've gone through, it looks a bit kind of brutally practical. Marry this, marry that, have the signet ring. But it looks fairly uncontentious. There are hints that there's a bit of fraying at the edges in this relationship. Now, I think you can see that in something that the much later historian, Cassius Dio says, because when Agrippa marries Julia, the daughter, Dio quotes another of Augustus's advisors saying to Augustus, "You've made that man so powerful that you must either now make him your son-in-law or you must kill him." There's a whiff of this power not being quite so simple and straightforward and possibly dangerous, that Agrippa could be actually a danger to Augustus.
So having him marry your daughter is that sort of line between friendship and enemy. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. It's a way of potentially neutralizing a possible rivalry, bringing him in super close.
There's another little hint which happens a bit less directly here, but it happens not long after the ring moment when Augustus is better. Later Roman historians report that Agrippa goes off to the east in what seems like an unseemly hurry. Right? And several of them suggest that he was going off in a bit of a huff, right, because he was fed up, they say, or some say, with Augustus now seeming to favour his nephew Marcellus, who, just to complicate things, is also Agrippa's brother-in-law, but we'll park that one, over Agrippa. Suetonius, for example, the biographer writing, a century or so later, says, and I've got the quote here, because of a slight suspicion of coolness and of a preference Augustus was showing for Marcellus, he threw up everything. That's Agrippa threw off everything and went off to the island of Lesbos. Right now, saying, and you just, I mean, we don't know how correct these are, these insinuations, but it's interesting that Roman historians have the same suspicions that you do, and they're looking for any hint that things aren't quite as rosy in the imperial family as they might seem. I mean, Pliny, for example.
Pliny the Elder, as opposed to Pliny the Younger.
Pliny suggests it was the other way round, and that actually this sudden departure was a de facto banishment of Agrippa by Augustus. Though Tacitus, the arch cynic, is no more cynical and suspicious Roman historian than Tacitus. He just says Agrippa was a bit tired, right? And went off, thought, right, I need a break. I need a holiday.
I need a Greek island holiday. I mean, Lesbos is whatever you can say about Lesbos, and very nice it is too, I'm sure. It's very far from the centre of power. So whatever he was doing there, it wasn't high politics.
That's absolutely true. And I think you are seeing just those whiffs of the microaggressions, favoritism, fallings out that actually characterize Roman court culture, almost any court culture, any time. But the kind of idea that Agrippa was just a very useful right-hand man, no problem, we have to put a question mark over that. Though, actually, that's all we can do. We can put a question mark, we can look for a few hints, but for the historian, there isn't any alternative version that you can confidently tell. You know that in the end, when Agrippa dies, and it's another few years after the Lesbos holiday, and several children later too, and a bit more fighting, when he finally does die, that's in 12 BCE. Where's he buried? Well, yeah, go on, tell us. Where's he buried, Charlotte?
He's buried in the mausoleum of Augustus, which is the family tomb that Augustus built, which you can still see today on the banks of the Tiber, up towards Piazza del Popolo near the Arapacus, and he's in there in the family tomb, which is incredibly sort of significant. Feels very significant. Feels very sort of telling that he ends up there with the family. He's part of what has become the imperial family. So he started off some kind of mate of Augustus in training camp in Albania from fairly obscure origins, and that we didn't know very little about him, and he ends up in the grand mausoleum of the Roman imperial family, having seen through the most remarkable, violent and seismic period in Roman history, and has come out effectively smart. He's come out alive. He died of natural causes, which is a huge achievement in that period.
I mean, we do need to say what's the historical take home of all that, and for me, I mean, it's partly historiographical. It's about what you can say or not say about him, because as you said, here we've got a key player of one of the, in some ways, best known, best documented periods of Roman history, and in some way he's a kind of linking thread between different members of the imperial family, and yet for all that key placing, we know surprisingly little about him. I mean, now, I don't think we should exaggerate quite how little because he is mentioned in later narratives, and there is one really famous image of him, actually on one of the most famous monuments of the city of Rome. You just mentioned the Areopagus, Augustus's altar of peace, with a procession represented on one side of members of the imperial family, and one of the most prominent figures there is the figure that is fairly confidently identified as Agrippa. We said he built the Pantheon, the temple of all the gods. His own version of that Pantheon was replaced, and it was rebuilt later by the Emperor Hadrian. But the Emperor Hadrian put up on his building, as if it was the same building, he plastered the name of Marcus Agrippa across the front of it. So one of the most in-your-face names of any Roman that you see when you're wandering around Rome, it's Agrippa, right?
And I think crucial to say that it's one of the most prominent things that you see now to this day. So by historical chance, you know, Agrippa's name, this sort of slightly shadowy figure, his name is visible right now in one of the most prominent squares in Rome. And it's always very resonant to see it.
I think that's true. There is a certain, he still has that kind of edgy prominence, but we cannot actually tell a coherent and consistent narrative of his life at all, really. And, I suppose that, to some extent, people might think, well, that is what happens to right-hand men. It is their job not to be remembered. It's their job to be always slightly at the sidelines. And if you were to be more cynical, I think this would be going too far, but it's, you've got to raise it. In some ways, it's in Augustus's interest to, yes, sure, keep him in the bosom of the family, but not have the memory of the man, say, who really won the Battle of Actium, not too celebrated. I mean, right-hand men can't, they mustn't take over. It's a dodgy position.
Yes, and if we think about the autobiography of Augustus, his splendidly titled Things Done, Things Achieved, Res Gestae, let's say the pronoun in use is I, not we, and he doesn't attribute, he just says, I did this, I did that, I built the other, I defeated these and those, and I got X numbers of triumphs. And it's got no mention of Agrippa. Let's face it, it's not like, I was helped tremendously by my amazing general Agrippa. So in other words, exactly as you say, it's like, the history of this period is so dominated by the version of events that Augustus's propaganda, what Augustus managed to still make us think about this period in history. And of course, Agrippa doesn't feature strongly in that. He is the power behind the throne. Very firmly behind it.
I think, and to kind of try to create, what were his achievements? Well, there's the military ones, that's fine. But that the infrastructure stuff is really important. I mean, and I think it's easy to forget that the Augustan regime is established on some not very glamorous sides too. It's established by providing public services, by having aqueducts that work, by having drains that work. And Agrippa, it looks like Agrippa is hugely important in that infrastructure. He's also important in a way that we shouldn't forget. He is said to have commissioned and put on display a map of the Roman Empire, right? Which goes, is talked about as Agrippa's map. Ever after, we don't entirely know what it looked like, but that's another hint at this sort of nuts and bolts style that I am going to show you what the Roman Empire consists in, and that is hugely important. It's a way of, it's not a map being used so we can get to the Danube. It's a map being used to say, look how big, efficient, and controlled the world is under Rome. And in some ways, that's Agrippa's mantra, really.
And for me, the image of him floating beneath the city of Rome in the Great Drain and the Cloaca Maxima, I mean, I know it's ridiculous in a way, but to me, it's incredibly resonant. He's like underneath. He's sort of under the surface. I know I'm getting into my fanciful metaphors here, but I like it. I like this as an image that he's in this, a huge city can't work without the shit and the urine being taken away. This is completely fundamental to any kind of civilization, effectively. And here he is under the streets of Rome. He's making it all work. He's slightly out of sight. And that's Agrippa. And everything you've said about the way he sort of disappears into the shadows, he can't quite be grasped. He must be built by us from fragments and mentions and inferences. I mean, in a way, that's ancient history in its purest form, right? That's what ancient historians have to do all the time, and he's a sort of tremendously resonant example of what the craft of ancient history is.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, he's an extreme example, and he's one, of course, that although there are many people we know a lot less about than Agrippa, but we when we're thinking about Augustus, what we really want to know, you can't help wanting to know, how did this look to Agrippa? What was Agrippa's perspective on this? And
what did he think? What did he feel?
Think? Right, we got some hints of dissatisfaction, but they're only hints. And we're hoping that in our next episode, Robert Harris will give at least some sort of fictional idea of how the world looked to Agrippa, because you really can't do it any more than we've done through plain old-fashioned history.
Looking forward very much to the fictional version of Agrippa next week. As ever, we want to know your thoughts and comments, ideas, questions. And so if you have them, please do send them to us at instantclassicspod@gmail.com or on our social media at instantclassicspod. Bye!